Why does Donald Trump want to break Cuba? There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. It's partly about timing.
Conditions continue to worsen in Cuba as the U.S. cuts off critical supplies to the communist regime there.
But it might also be deeply personal.
Cuba is a disaster. It's run by incompetent, senile men.
Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about because Cuba is a failing nation right now, very badly failing nation.
Timing-wise, Cuba has almost never been weaker. It's literally in the dark. Chronic blackouts. Because to generate electricity, Cuba needs oil. But it can't get enough oil because the U.S. is blocking its two main sources of oil, Venezuela.
President Trump says the U.S. carried out large-scale strikes on Venezuela overnight.
They lived off Venezuelan money and oil, and none of that's coming now.
And Mexico. The U.S. has put immense pressure on both countries to choke Cuba's energy supply.
The Cuban government is really in a difficult position right now. It is in the midst of a humanitarian crisis.
But also, look who's advising Trump on foreign policy.
Do you want to say something about that, Marco, please?
Well, I mean, I just gave you a statement a few minutes ago about, when the president speaks, you should take him seriously.
Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is the son of Cuban immigrants. And for those who feel like they've lost a great deal in Castro's socialist revolution in the 1960s, their literal homes in many cases, punishing the regime is personal.
Yeah, look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned.
He made his political career based on hostility toward the Cuban government. And so, in some ways, the policy of hostility towards Cuba is very much his personal policy.
But finally, consider how this might be personal for Donald Trump, too.
13 U.S. presidents have come and gone, and the Castro regime remains in power.
Cuba's communist existence has been a real knot of tension for the U.S. for the better part of a century. If Donald Trump were to undo that knot,
finally bringing down a communist regime that's been 90 miles off the coast of the U.S. would be a huge feather in the cap of Donald Trump.
Being able to say that I am the U.S. president who did the thing that no other U.S. president since 1959 was able to do, which was end the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban Communist government.
What a crowning achievement that would be.
America is doing in Cuba is terrorism, completely stopping any oil or fuel and food and everything getting into Cuba is terrorism. Like, they are actively doing what they are doing for political gain and to try and basically either one, force Cuba to concede to the United States, or two, make it so the Cuban people decide to try and overthrow their government, where they will then go in and instill a puppet government for themselves. And I know this says Trump's fuel embargo, but don't get it twisted. This is the entirety of the US establishment. This is Democrats and Republicans, because they hate, deep down, they hate the fact that they do not have complete control of the entire area surrounding them. They hate the fact that there is at least one country in their vicinity that will not bow down to the United States. Long live the Cuban people, long live the Cuban Revolution, and down with America, death to America.
Donald Trump is an economic terrorist. He just declared a national emergency over Cuba, absurdly labeling the small island nation an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. What? A country of 11 million people, besieged by U.S. sanctions for over 6 decades, is a threat to the most powerful country on earth? It's absurd. It's the other way around. And now with the U.S. forcing Venezuela to stop supplying oil to Cuba and putting the same pressure on Mexico, Trump, really Marco Rubio, smells blood and sees this as a chance to finish the job by denying Cuba any source of oil. Under this new decree, the U.S. government can impose tariffs on any country that sells or provides oil to Cuba directly or indirectly. And what does cutting off oil to a small island mean? No hospitals can function, no electricity, transportation stops, food doesn't get to the markets, and people go hungry. This is not abstract. The U.S. blockade has already left Cuba with crippling fuel shortages, blackouts, collapsing infrastructure. Are we really prepared to starve a neighboring people because they have a government that doesn't bend to U.S. pressure? Because they nationalized properties decades ago? Because Marco Rubio wants to be a hero to right-wing Cuban Americans in Florida? This is economic warfare. It's violence. It's collective punishment, which is illegal under international humanitarian law. This savage act designed to bring Cuba to its knees by starving its people must be opposed by all compassionate people around the world. Now is the time to say basta. Lift the blockade. Let Cuba live.
This is the front page of the largest newspaper in Spain today. Here's the original front cover of El País. It says the sinking of Cuba or the collapse of Cuba, with a drawing of Donald Trump smoking a Cuban cigar. And here's an AI translated cover so you can see what it looks like in English. The subheadline says, Trump's strategy to cut off oil is suffocating this island. It's not just Spain, the entire world is talking about this. But if you're from the US, you might not even know what's going on because US media isn't really talking about this. So for a little background, the US has been trying to overthrow the Cuban regime for the last 60 years. Now Donald Trump and Marco Rubio are getting more desperate and more ruthless. Now what we're seeing is essentially what we saw happen in Gaza. The Trump regime has completely wiped out the oil supply to Cuba, first via Venezuela, and now by threatening other countries who sell oil to Cuba with debilitating tariffs. And just a couple days ago, one of Cuba's 3 main oil refineries went up in smoke, and they don't know what happened. And now, of course, it's the Cuban people who are suffering. Hospitals are running on generators that are about to completely stop. Shortage of medicines is close to 70%. Food is spoiling without refrigeration. They're living in near blackouts. Public transportation has completely halted. Now the entire world is pleading for this to end. Mexico sent humanitarian aid. And it's no coincidence that this guy, Marco Rubio, has long wanted the Cuban regime to fall. And they haven't been subtle about it either. Just a couple weeks ago, Donnie T joked on Truth Social that Marco Rubio could be Cuba's next leader. If you're new here, I am Caitlin. I'm a US immigrant living in Mexico, and I share global headlines for Americans so they can see what the rest of the world is talking about, as well as expose hypocrisy within the MAGA regime, usually in a more lighthearted way because the news is depressing enough on its own.
As more and more time goes by and oil shipments don't arrive to Cuba, stop by the Trump administration's insistence that countries are no longer able to send the government, the Cuban government, any kind of oil, saying that Cuba represents a threat to the United States. We are seeing the impacts more and more here. There are less cars on the road. Now we're hearing that airlines are cutting flights to Cuba because there's not any jet fuel for them here to be able to refuel and bring the passengers back home. So this is, of course, going to have an impact. There'll be less tourists coming here. It really becomes a chain reaction for the already struggling Cuban economy. Mexico is sending aid, hundreds of tons of food, but they're not at this point sending any oil under U.S. pressure to not do that. The Kremlin has said that Cuba is now facing a crisis. The government here, essentially their ally, their old ally, is in deep trouble as what they call a U.S. chokehold continues on and on. We know the U.S. and Cuba are exchanging messages. They are holding talks. Remains to be seen, though, if any deal can be struck, because the U.S. is really insisting on regime change. The government leave power, open up to multi-party elections, that political prisoners here are freed, and a lot of other steps that the Cuban government, up until now, has been unwilling to agree to.